This really answers the question of, is the employer required to give hazard pay, which many employers may be asking themselves as they see other employers pay it, whether or not the federal government actually is requiring them to pay hazard pay. You're listening to Legal Skinny Podcast with Trisha Barita. I'm a 15-year licensed practicing attorney in the state of Texas. I created Legal Skinny because when I've been invited to do educational seminars on different subjects in employment law, employers and HR professionals would often ask me, where can they find out a little more information on this or a little more information on that? Look, I get it. There's a lot of resources out there, but sometimes it's confusing and people are so busy. Sometimes people have only 30 or 15 or maybe even 5 minutes in their day to devote to learning something new. On this podcast, you'll hear me have discussions and interviews on topics relevant to employers. Disclaimer though, Legal Skinny is for entertainment and informational purposes only, not meant to provide legal advice and doesn't create an attorney-client relationship. Also remember, laws change or they differ by jurisdiction. So this is not a substitute for seeking legal counsel in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you. Hello, and welcome to the Legal Skinny Brief, Hazardous Duty Pay, to owe or not to owe. So hazardous duty pay has been in the media quite a bit lately due to COVID-19 and because many employers have been paying hazardous duty pay based on what type of workforce they have. Now, some of these employers are paying this as an incentive to continue to have employees show up to work in situations where, employees may be feeling uncomfortable or may feel that there's more of a risk for them to be exposed to COVID-19. Some of these have been due to maybe agreements that the employers and employees had in certain situations where they would get hazardous duty pay. Some local governments, state or local governments, have determined to pay their workers some type of hazardous duty pay in relation, again, to agreements they decided or because those governments decided that that was the choices that they wanted to make in order to continue to incentivize workers to work for them. So many employers may, seeing this in the media, be asking, should they be paying hazardous duty pay? And exactly what does that all entail? And what would be the steps they would take in order to pay hazardous duty pay? So let's take a look at what the actual hazardous duty pay generally is defined as. The Department of Labor references hazard pay as pay for performing hazardous duty or work involving physical hardship. So it could be for holding a position that's hazardous, or it could be for an employee performing a duty in a location that may be considered hazardous. Or it could be both, right? So the Department of Labor also states that work duty that causes extreme physical discomfort and distress, which is not adequately alleviated by protective devices, is deemed to impose a physical hardship. Now, generally, you're going to see this type of hazard pay, and sometimes it does have other names, but it's a supplement to the employee's base pay. When you see it identified as hazard duty pay, it can also be referenced as HDP. Although lately, again, in the media, we've seen the employers claim it as different types of pay, maybe their way to thank the employee. But overall, maybe the general concept might be that it's coming from this sort of position of the original thought of hazard pay. Now, recently, the Department of Labor specifically addressed hazard pay in the COVID-19 and the Fair Labor Standards Act Q&A number 17. This really answers the question of, is the employer required to give hazard pay, which many employers may be asking themselves as they see other employers pay it, whether or not the federal government actually is requiring them to pay hazard pay. So, in the DOL's response under the Fair Labor Standards Act Q&A, they stated this question: is hazard pay required under the Fair Labor Standards Act (FLSA) for employees working during the COVID-19 pandemic? And the DOL answers no. The FLSA does not require hazard pay. FLSA generally requires only payment of at least the federal minimum wage, currently $7.25 per hour, for each hour worked, and overtime compensation for each hour over 40 worked in a work week in the amount of at least 1.5 times the employee's regular rate of pay. So then you might be asking yourselves, well, in what circumstances would an employer then pay hazard pay? And the DOL continues on in this answer to sort of address that issue. Issues such as hazard pay, the DOL states, are usually determined privately between employers and employees or their authorized representatives. State or local laws may also impose other obligations. So they encourage employers to maybe contact the state labor office to determine whether there are any state laws that address hazard pay. So when they're talking about these employer and employee agreements or their authorized representatives, they may be referencing, of course, unions, unionized collective bargaining agreements, and the agreements that were made between those parties. So, on behalf of a large group of individual employee workforces, they may be talking about policies that an employer's put in place related to some type of hazard pay, or just a new type of pay that the employer is offering now currently under the COVID-19 pandemic to reduce the amount of turnover, to encourage employees to come to work, to thank those employees for the work that they're doing under certain circumstances. There has been some talk and discussion about this becoming a requirement for certain types of, industries, particularly, the healthcare provider industry. But at this point, as you can see, that's why the Department of Labor came out right now to sort of clarify at this point that is not what the FLSA requires. So that's the legal skinny brief on hazard pay. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Legal Skinny Podcast. Do not forget to subscribe to get future podcast episodes. Also, check out LegalSkinny.com to join our newsletter and get details on all the educational resources we offer the employer. Also, disclaimer, remember Legal Skinny is for entertainment and informational purposes only, not meant to provide legal advice, and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Laws change or they differ by jurisdiction. So also remember, this is not a substitute for seeking legal counsel in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you.